Hello, I'm back now to talk to you about lexical studies in African languages, strong tests of universal structure. It appears to be a human universal that people everywhere talk about each other using personality descriptive terms. This might start with socializing children, be obedient, be kind, be patient. And people also talk to each other about who's good at valued tasks, who can you trust, who do you like to be around. But what are the most important commonly used terms? How do they fit together into a structure? And how similar are those terms and structures across contexts? As I touched on earlier, lexical studies of personality offer a systematic way to address these questions. This method was conceptualized in the early 20th century as a way to objectively define personality structure. They weren't originally emphasized as a way to make cross-cultural comparisons, but by the 1980s, Lou Goldberg was pointing out their potential for that. As I also mentioned, an advantage of this approach is that it's a standard methodology that can be applied across settings. And as recommended by leaders in cultural psychology, these studies combine emic and etic elements. You can learn from the new culture what's relevant here by building a model from the ground up, but you aren't so locally focused that you fail to notice if the construct that you're looking at also exists in other places, but under a different name. And then you can easily include marker scales to score scales for outside etic models. So there's a quantitative way to test for replication and to test exactly what the extent is that local dimensions overlap or don't overlap with etic ones. But as I argued before, prior lexical studies have rarely made full use of their emic potential. In many cases, they've only included PCA, principal components analysis, on ipsitized data with 5, maybe 6 factors, and a visual inspection comparison to Goldberg's 1990 Big Five. But there wasn't a theoretical reason for Goldberg's initial analytic choices. And Varimax rotation can be shown to basically ensure that you'll get 5 or 6 factors with this number of variables. Saucier and Iarino recently reanalyzed Goldberg's data with a systematic approach that meets and builds on currently accepted standards for choosing the structure and testing the robustness of models. They ultimately found support for a 20-factor model rather than 5 in this same data. And even despite this sometimes limited exploration of the data, by the 2000s, as more lexical evidence had accumulated, the difficulties of finding the Big Five were apparent. Meta-analyses proposed other models as perhaps more universal. Here's 3 of the big contenders. All of these models came to their conclusions by testing across groups of lexical studies, but ultimately answering questions about, is there a universal model? It requires a larger corpus of representative lexical studies. So I shared a vision with Gerard Saucier to broaden the base of personality information with African language lexical studies. Their cultural distance from weird Western industrialized contexts makes for a really strong test. If the same terms and models arise here, that's really good evidence for something being universal. Africa, however, is the most linguistically diverse place on the planet, with 1/3 of the world's living languages. So the idea was to start with 1 from each of the 3 main language groups in sub-Saharan Africa and in communities with different social, economic, and geographic characteristics. The goal was also to combine really strong emic and etic components. In 2019, I was able to lead finishing the studies for which Saucier had collected data in Ma from among the Maasai, who are herders in Kenya, and in study 2, the Senefo speakers from Mali in West Africa. In both of these studies, our Big 2 model was replicated, but no other models were supported. And the emic models found were 5 factors in Ma and 10 in Senufo. I can't go into detail about those models, but just one example I'd like to give. In neither of these studies did we see anything like openness or extroversion. But in Senufo, one factor that emerged was hardworkingness. So in Senufo, the list had a lot of different words in Senufo, but they were all translated into English as something like lazy, 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 but they were different words in Senufo. So this is a context where people live in small villages around the same people most of their lives, and they grow food without domestic animals. So they're quite dependent on each other for survival. So they don't talk a lot to each other about who's the most chatty person, who's gregarious, who's open-minded, who's into art and music. What they spontaneously speak about and have a really rich, varied vocabulary for is how hardworking you are. This is an example of how a lexical study can reveal aspects of human interaction with the local society and conditions. So this is what can be interesting about lexical studies if we let the emic data speak. So this left Khoekhoe from the original vision, and thanks to a project grant I received in 2018 from the Swiss National Science Foundation, this became possible. Khoekhoe is spoken by 2 main groups in Namibia, the Nama to the south and the Damara more to the north. And overall, this was, there were 2 components to this, 2 mixed methods components, so actually 4 different studies. But I'm going to just talk to you about the lexical study primarily today. Some specific goals I brought to the lexical study. I wanted to build on the strengths of the prior work in Africa and find a strategy to get bigger samples and use longer lists of variables, despite needing to collect the data by interview. I also wanted this to be the first lexical study that I know of to incorporate follow-up qualitative interviews to aid in the interpretation of results and to explore some of the content that might be missing. So first, creating the lexical survey, we went from a couple thousand words out of the dictionary to 272 on our list. And this was thanks to ratings on their frequency of use and on their relevance to personality. For data collection, we recruited a team of 15 school teachers of Khoekhoe from throughout Namibia. This was a way to get representation of the whole country and to have interviewers who read and write Khoekhoe well. Involving them was one of the best things we did. This study fit with their interests in their language, so they've all devoted their careers to Khoekhoe, and they became quite enthused about this project to look at what happens with personality description in their language. 3 people in this group are published authors in Khoekhoe, 1 person who's a radio personality in the language, and 3 people on the National Commission for the Language. Teachers are also very highly respected in their communities, so they became quite effective ambassadors for the project and made it interesting to people throughout the country. They came to Windhoek for this training weekend. We all got to know each other. They practiced the interview, and they also provided a lot of quality control on the study materials. Then the teachers went home to their respective towns and villages and with printed questionnaires, and they found participants. They recruited people to administer the survey to, and then Sylvanus Job and our driver and I, we traveled around the country to visit them, to bring them supplies, troubleshoot any issues. We ended up with over 600 participants, of which we retained 500 for analyses. We ran through our analysis first in a preliminary way to assess for challenges in interpretation. And as expected, we identified some terms, 26 specifically, that we weren't confident about. For example, there was a term defined in the dictionary as hospitable, but it loaded only with terms meaning anxiety. So we wondered why. And then there was this term, it was defined as prone to blackmail, and that was just a little hard for us to picture exactly what that meant. So Sylvanus Job and I, again, traveled around the country. We talked to 22 different people in different towns and villages. We asked about those specific terms that we weren't sure about, some other questions that belonged to another project. Relevant here, among those 272 most used terms to describe people, none related to extroversion or openness. And this was similar from what we'd seen in Ma and Senufo. And it's also been reported for other African languages in translating Big Five inventories. It's hard to even find the vocabulary for these constructs. So we wondered why. Are these distinctions not known, or are they just not encoded into single words? So to answer that question first, interestingly, we found that almost everyone that we spoke to could think of someone that they would refer to with the terms that we used for this. And I have some quotes here of how they used those concepts. And we found that their spontaneous, open-ended responses really supported an understanding of both of these constructs, very similar to that of Western personality psychologists. So this is a good example of how personality description has both universal and culturally specific aspects. On the one hand, the lack of equivalent frequently used terms in these languages suggests that these concepts have been less useful and less relevant here. But on the other hand, when asked to describe someone with these qualities, the conceptualization appears to be quite similar. In terms of better understanding specific terms, we dropped 3 that were too inconsistently understood by participants. And for 22 terms, we updated the definition to improve our ability to interpret factors. So for example, there was this term, guaraha, which had been defined as prone to blackmail. When we spoke to multiple people, it emerged, it became very clear what this term actually meant, which is this is somebody who wants to hold on to power, likes to be in a position of power over others. So once we understood that, this was much easier to picture. So now with 269 total terms and improved definitions, we reran our series of PCAs to define the optimal local emic model. We used a multi-step process to settle on the most robust model. This was building on the systematic approach of Saussure and Iarina. Following parallel analysis, we started with a maximum of 18 factors. And from there, we looked for the largest interpretable models. So they're both quantitative and qualitative aspects to interpretability, using the 2 types of data and 3 rotation strategies. So these were the largest interpretable models, the size of those models in each of those 6 combinations. So these became our 6 candidate models. And then we compared each of those models for robustness across data type and rotation strategies. So this is a sensitivity analysis. And we ended up with a model of 11 factors as the most robust. Here are the average robustness correlations across the 2 comparisons. And what you see here is on the right are our 6 candidate models, which were all pretty large. The smallest one was 7 factors. But then on the left, we put the 6 models, Varamax rotation, 1 through 6 factors that are typically all that's looked at in lexical studies. And what you see is that the model we chose of 11 factors is not only the most robust among our candidates, but of all those models. It's the least sensitive to method variations, even compared to these much smaller, simpler models at 2, 3, 4 factors. And they're pretty much the worst model is the Varamax 5. So here is the 11 factor model with the 5 top learning terms for each. So this is obviously just giving you a tiny glimpse of this model. One interesting thing is that the first factor, so this is of course the factor that explains the most variance in the data set. So something really relevant in the local society. We call it temperance because on the one hand, on one pole is religious engagement, and on the negative pole is substance abuse. So this really reflects the local culture where substance abuse is heavily moralized and linked to a lack of religious engagement, and religion is very, very important in people's lives. So just to help put this 11-factor model into slightly better context, I'm showing you here correlations between those 11 factors and all the EDIC marker scales for multiple models. I've put in yellow highlight here the only 4 that are 0.5 or above, and then in red are those 0.3 and above, so moderate correlations. Red for emphasis. So the Khoikhoi dimension that we call pro-social diligence correlates especially with conscientiousness and also with agreeableness. The one we call morality correlates with social self-regulation, agreeableness, and honesty. Temper negatively correlated with affiliation and agreeableness, small correlation with extroversion. And courage versus fear correlates positively with dynamism, emotional stability, and resiliency. But 7 of the 11 emic factors had very little overlap with EDIC factors, no correlations 0.4 or higher. So they're defining content that is largely outside the scope of these imported EDIC models. And you can see that there were 3 EDIC scales, those in the yellow highlight, that had no correlations even at the 0.3 level, and then in the orange color are those that didn't have any correlations at the 0.4 level. As far as specific replication of the EDIC models, so here we used those traditional models with Varimax rotation, 1 through 6 factors, to match what's been done before to maximize the chance for replication. And you see that the big one, so the range of evaluative terms that shows up in a single factor in lexical studies everywhere so far, is impressively similar across contexts. No other model replicated strongly, but the big 2, the pan-cultural 3, were moderately correlated, but not the big 5 or 6. So in summary of that part, we defined the optimal emic model to be of 11 factors. We did not replicate the big 5 or big 6, but we found similarities to other languages at 1, 2, and 3 factor levels. So before I close, I just want to make a brief mention of the study that followed in 2019. The focus was on psychological disorder symptoms, but we also included a survey created from this lexical study. So 38 key terms for 10 of the 11 traits. And then we compared that to a big 6 model in terms of how well the 2 personality inventories predicted physical and mental health, religiosity, well-being. We found that the local Khoikhoi inventory had some advantages. So this is the change in R-square is what I've got graphed here. And this is including age and gender at step 1, and then all of the scales, either the KPI or the QB6 scales at step 2. And the change in R-square after age and gender. And you see that the KPI had advantages overall, in particular with regard to religious engagement, total psychological disorder symptoms, and substance abuse. This is logical because these domains were included among the most used terms in Khoikhoi. So to conclude, local personality models built from the ground up in African languages are not the big 5. We can export big 5 measures to many places. This has been done and it works okay. Just like we can import traits from other places and use them in the West if we want to. Sometimes this importing, exporting is a choice we want to make depending on our study goals. But when we only and exclusively do that, we miss out on learning what is most relevant and most interesting in other places in the majority world. And we live in a kind of illusion that what's true for us in the West is just what is true of human beings. We don't distinguish, even for our own selves on a personal level, what is just part of being human and what is a product of our own cultural context. So thank you very much. This is the end of our symposium, and we're really looking forward to hearing your comments and answering any questions you might have when we all come together on July 16th. Thanks again.